Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, Chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Section, and I'm so honored today to have as our special guest, the Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who is the founder and CEO of the Hip Hop Caucus. Reverend Yearwood, if I may call you Rev.
Yes, sir. That's what everybody calls me.
That's what I know. Everybody calls you Rev. Welcome. So glad to have you today.
Man, Attorney Thomas, it's so good to be with you. Man, it's a pleasure.
Well, we're honored to have you today. And let me just kick off asking you one of the obvious questions you probably get all the time. What is the mission and the work of the Hip Hop Caucus? What was your inspiration for founding the Hip Hop Caucus? And if you could connect the Hip Hop Caucus to what I know you also love, hip hop music and the hip hop generation.
Yeah, no, that's actually, it's actually probably a much more layered question than it is, than people may think. Hip Hop Caucus was started in 2004 during that election cycle. It was focusing primarily on democracy. At that time, I was working with some folks like Diddy and Jay-Z and many others who were in hip hop. Right. My friend, Dr. Ben Chavis, had brought me over into this process to see how we could just kind of bring in all the energy. We saw clearly that one was using their political experience. We wanted to shape that process around the culture. And so the mission of it is really quite simple, is to fight for liberation of particularly Black people and people of color, really to lift up the issues of fair treatment for all people, using one's cultural expression to shape one's political experience. And now, almost 20 years later, it has become the largest hip hop political organization in the world. It has received numerous awards, from the Italia Moffat Human Rights Award to many awards from Democracy and Economic Justice. And so this is an amazing organization. And I think that all that stems from the core mission of how do we make our communities better.
Right. I want to applaud you. I have followed your work for many years. Also being an ordained minister, what I love about your work, that you've taken your ministry to the streets.
Yeah.
I think you and I would agree that ministry does not begin and end on Sunday morning.
Most definitely.
That's right. And so you've taken protest and you moved it to public policy. Your work in New Orleans around Hurricane Katrina, voting rights in 2008, and now you're doing environmental justice work and climate change. Could you speak to what the Hip Hop Caucus is doing currently? And I love the sign that you've got on your hat and also on your wall there, Hip Hop Caucus Think. Could you talk about, I assume what you mean by being a critical thinker, one who analyzes public policy and issues strategically and critically?
Well, actually, this is actually, you hit on to it. This actually was co-created with us and New Era, who was a hat company. Okay. Everybody probably sees them on the baseball fields. Yeah. But actually, it's Think 100%. You can actually see the 100%.
Oh, okay.
is in the middle there. And right. What that means is that we have to get to clean and 100% clean energy by 2030. So that's actually like hip hop, we always try to mix things in. So it's obviously in front of you, but sometimes you don't get to see it. So this is also, you kind of hit it. It's also a thinking cap. Right. And so hopefully we can think as we try to find solutions. Right. But you're right. For me, I want to start with the faith piece, actually, to your question. Faith is critical. Faith doesn't start and stop on Sunday. And when you're doing this work, when you see harm and hurt in our communities, you need faith. You need faith to continue to push you on. You need faith to overcome obstacles. You need faith to deal with the Goliaths that are trying to hurt your communities. And so one of those things, the Hip Hop Caucus is a multi-issue organization. We deal with civil and human rights, we deal with economic justice, we deal with democracy. And one of the things you mentioned is around environmental justice. Mm-hmm. And environmental justice simply is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so with that, our job is to make sure that our communities are not receiving their overburden of pollution that is causing the injustice. So we know, for instance, that 68% of people of color, particularly Black people, live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, causing emphysema and cancer and other diseases that harm those communities. On top of that, we know that these are the same things that cause the climate crisis. And we know that those are the things that we are first and worst impacted when you have droughts and wildfires, or for my home state, Louisiana, you have hurricanes. That is the thing here why we had to be involved in ensuring that we could deal with both climate justice and environmental justice, and hopefully with Think 100%, which is our capstone climate program. Our goal is to get to 100% renewable clean energy by 2030, so that we can stop what we see now in regards to the disastrous impacts of climate change.
I want to follow up with you on your answer. You talked about vulnerable communities that are living in, polluted areas, either be the air, the water. I've often wondered when I see those communities, where is the nearest church to that neighborhood? And what is the church doing in response, if anything? Could you kind of share, particularly as a man of faith, a proud graduate of the Howard Divinity School?
Yes, indeed.
That's right. What is the role of the church in the context of advancing and promoting economic justice, environmental justice, but the overall just social justice work?
Yeah, so the role of the church is to not be complicit in the destruction of the community and where it sits. The role of the church is to be there for the people and not be there to get the 30 pieces of silver. The role of the church is to do, literally, depending on what faith tradition you come, mine is Christian. Right. But if you're a Muslim, if you're Jewish, if you're Buddhist, obviously for me as Christian, I follow Christ. The role there is to ensure that we can speak to the powers that be, and if it even requires to overturning the money tables in the chamber, that we have the courage to do that. So I think that in this situation, that our churches are throughout this country and the world, and they sit literally in the places where I understand the need for preaching and teaching about faith, but there also needs to be action. There's a great scripture that simply says that, without faith, without works, faith is dead. And so I think that one of the things there for us is that the church has to be a beacon. And too many times it's also siding with industry. They're literally siding with those who are polluting our community. They're taking that money, those 30 pieces of silver, from these industries. They're taking it from, we see it, and even in Atlanta, and with Cop City. There are those who are siding with certain issues that are harming our community. And so the church has to be a place where people can look at again as not just a cathedral that is like a museum, but a place where there's an action, there's a kairos that is happening in that place that is moving things forward. I think that in regards to environmental justice, for an example, I'm from Louisiana. Right. So in St. James Parish, for example, there is the Formosa plastic chemical plant, which sits in that parish. And Hip Hop Caucus, along with Sharon Levine, who runs Rise St. James, which is a faith-based organization, amongst many, many others who are there in that community, used faith to take on, to fight against the petrochemical industry, and still doing that. That's one of our main issues right now that we're dealing with. But that issue is very critical because we're seeing that if we don't deal with that, churches who are complicit then if they're complicit on the front end, then they'll have coffins on the back end. They'll have people in their churches who will have breast cancer. They have people in their churches who will have types of ailments that will cause their lives to be shortened. So we need them to be courageous right now in the midst of, and we need them to have a spirit of David versus Goliath. And that's, I think, what's needed for those churches, particularly not only for that, but also in regards to this, what's going on for democracy and economic justice and then civil and human rights as well.
What I hear you saying is that clergy in the church need to be or have what I call dual competencies. We just can't have the role of the church focused on the Bible and faith, which is important, critically important. But there's also a commitment to understanding life here on earth and the impact that policy and decisions that are being made that impact people's communities and their lives.
That's correct. I mean, when you mentioned my great seminary I went to at Howard Divinity, when I was there, I was one of the very few people who was a teacher's assistant for both New Testament and Old Testament, which meant I had to learn all the languages that was engaged in that process. And all that is wonderful. So I can tell you everything about New Testament. As a matter of fact, before I kind of went through the activist route, was en route to get my PhD in biblical studies and to teach Old Testament. So I say this knowing very clearly the power of the Bible and the power of Scripture.
That's right.
But I also say this, that people are missing the fact that people need people of faith to be strong in this moment. And that means willing to sacrifice. It means truly believing what you say you believe. It means that if you believe there's something beyond this, that you act accordingly to that you stand up and you move like that. And this isn't just also this for this preachers. Let me say this. I was in the Air Force. I was a chaplain. So in that process. So when I was in the Air Force, we had to go through officer training school. And in that, you'd go through all the professions. So the lawyers, the doctors, the nurses, the preachers. I could tell you, we all couldn't run a mile too fast. It was pretty bad. We were the slowest bunch out the batch who was trying to do push-ups and sit-ups. But one thing I realized then is that we all, in a professional standpoint, lawyers and doctors, preachers, nurses, all those took an oath. And we had to, there's a difference in our profession. It's even when we are engaging with people, there's a method of what we can keep private, what we're told that's given to us. And I think that for those of us who are in professions, particularly those of us who are lawyers and doctors and preachers, that tradition, particularly for Black people, is something that we need to hold dear and have courage to move forward, that our communities in this lifetime are better.
Right. That's a great segue to my next question, moving to helping us think about what is the role of the lawyer in this space. What do you hope to see, or what would you like to see lawyers do or continue doing on an elevated level, if you will, to support the work of the Hip Hop Caucus, not only just the caucus, but also the important issues around climate, environmental justice, voting, just the overall economic justice work that you're doing? How can lawyers play a role?
Many ways. Well, for me as an activist, as you kind of alluded to earlier, I've been in the back of a few police cars fighting the good fight. And so you need a good lawyer, one, to make sure to get you out of that situation. That's first and foremost. So if any activists, any young people watching this, or young lawyers, whoever, make sure you got some good legal folks on your side if you're going to be an activist. That's important. I would probably spend a lot more time in the hoop scows, they say, if I didn't have that. So that's one. But on a larger conversation, one thing I know is that we talk about demonstration from my world, that we have to go out there and demonstrate and agitate and demonstrate. We need to have demonstration, but demonstration without litigation leads to frustration. If we don't have the litigation and that aspect to this work, we're going to be in trouble. And I think that what's needed from lawyers is that they need to, they need to get in there and litigate as strongly as they can. And that's a hard process, because what people don't understand is that with litigation, it takes time.
Right.
And people don't understand, and from the movement standpoint, they don't understand, well, man, we out here in the streets, we need folks in the suites to get it. And,
Right.
and it's important for lawyers to explain that process, that listen, it takes time to put together a briefing. It takes time to put together put together our argument. It takes time to go through the process of going through the courts. It takes time to deal with that. And I think that that's an important just education aspect that's needed very much. The next thing I think, where I think from lawyers in this moment, is that clearly, the courts are becoming very critical to this conversation. We're seeing case law that folks are using to gut, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency. They're gutting regulations. They're gutting voting rights. They're gutting, just basic human rights. And so it's critical for us to make sure that from that aspect that we're doing all we can to ensure that we're in these courts, we're hearing these situations, obviously being non-biased as we must be, but also that we're being fair. And I think that's what's not happening now. And I'll say one last thing I think is important from the standpoint from the lawyers is always legislation. I mentioned litigation is critical, but also demonstration without legislation leads to frustration. And so we're going to need to shape policy. And one thing I would tell anybody that either you shape policy or policy shapes you. And for too long, policy has been shaping us. And so we definitely need folks to be on the policy shaping side to ensure that our communities are protected.
I want to ask you about your work and your engagement with young people. You mentioned the younger adults in an earlier answer. I had the honor of watching you interview along with our mutual friend, Attorney Ben Crump, State Representative Justin Pearson, Memphis, earlier this year, in light of what happened in the Tennessee legislature. I loved how you and Ben were engaging this young brother who's probably 15, 20 years younger than the three of us.
No doubt.
We used to be the young adults, but not so much anymore. But I loved how you were encouraging him and kind of supporting him and kind of just sharing with him and allowing him to share with you as well, you and Ben. Could you kind of talk about the work you're doing to connect our generation with that millennial generation and how you see that unfolding in the future?
Yeah, well, first, me give a big shout out to Attorney Ben Crump, dear friend and just a good brother. Just amazing at what he does in that aspect. And Justin J. Pearson, the young brother from Memphis, who's now in the state house there, was kicked out and was brought back and just doing great work using his platform. I think the key thing for us, and I think Ben understands this, and I know others understand this, is that when we were coming into the movement, we came in kind of on the heels of the civil rights movement and those powerhouses at that time. And they, in many cases, themselves were evolving. And they were evolving in a way where I think that they didn't really have a retirement plan. They were kind of in a position where they came in through some hard road, and so they didn't really pass on. Some of them were. I mean, I was mentored by Dorothy Irene Height. So by being from Dr. Height and many others like that, I mean, they obviously they put into us. I want to make sure people understand. They actually sowed into us. But I'm saying though that they didn't quite understand the institutions aspect. And so I think the thing that's important is that many of us thought that we then had to be individuals and not build in institutions. And I think this is where I think what Attorney Crump is doing on Jamaica through his law firm. I know what I'm working with many others, like the amazing Tanya Clayhouse and Dr. Cynthia Swan and many others at Hip Hop Caucus, is to build an institution. And in building an institution, it allows for millennials and Gen Z I work with all of them. But it allows for them to both succeed and fail. And I think that's the one thing that allows them to put their hands on the plow and to move things forward. So we are in a unique position, Hip Hop Caucus, because we actually, there's no kiddie table at the Hip Hop Caucus. There's no place where we ask for like a young people's, and I have nothing wrong with groups that have that. I'm just saying that we don't have that. We actually require them to get in to use their genius because we need them now, in a way. And so it's interesting to see them operate in that kind of form. And so we to see them kind of prosper and again to fail and succeed. So I work with young people and then also we work with young folks who are both from the academy, those, like us who've gone to either divinity school or law school or gone to undergraduate or whatever. But also we work with a lot of folks who are in the streets. And we actually believe that there is what we call GOTA, that's GOTA, which is genius outside the academy. That we need to encourage the Fannie Lou Hamers of our movement who have a clear genius in that aspect. And so I think that sometimes we miss that. Folks who, organizing a gang sometimes in the middle of the night, you may think that might be some bad activity. Sometimes that's genius. Like, my goodness, you're a born organizer. We just got to get you from doing what you're doing and bring you onto this side and use those skills for organizing and energizing and for good. And so I think that's what we do a lot of at Hip Hop Caucus, that we work with a lot of different peeps from different communities, both from the academy, young people who are at Howard or Hampton or Morehouse, Spelman, wherever, but also those from the streets, the GOTA, the genius outside the academy, those from Chicago and Detroit and Baltimore, those folks. We want to get them engaged because we need their Fannie Lou Hamer genius.
Well, Rev, I am so glad for several things. One, that you had the good sense to mention Morehouse. I spent some time in the class of 1992. I'm also glad that you are our guest today. And I also want to thank you as we wrap up for being one of our sponsors for our Economic Justice Summit.
Most definitely.
At Georgetown's Law Center back in March. I appreciate your support. And I also want to acknowledge and just lift up that we're going to be doing some more work with you. We're in collaboration now to develop a partnership between the ABA and the Hip Hop Caucus that hopefully we'll be announcing in the next several weeks. So thank you for being my guest today. Thank you for all the work you're doing. You are truly one of God's trombones.
Thank you so much.
Truly a social engineer. And so we thank you for all that you're doing, and have a good afternoon and God bless you.
Thank you so much. All power to the people.
Thank you. Thank you for listening today to this week's Chair Chat. See you next week.